The decline of aristocracy. World War I had a devastating impact on the British upper classes. The sons of the aristocracy, fortunate enough to survive the war, returned to find their place in society no longer automatically assured. Their numbers were severely reduced. Even the Prime Minister's son was killed. This meant that in the immediate post-war, those who had been expected to become leaders, particularly in politics and business, were no longer there. There was also a fall in the number of those willing to work as their servants. History professor Joanna Bork says, "In the past, the servant class in upper-middle-class homes were those people whose family tradition was to work there. When someone left, the cook would recommend her niece, and that no longer happened." The introduction of conscription had turned a professional army into a civilian one. New officers could now come from humble backgrounds and, like the many thousands of emancipated women, they were not prepared to abandon the possibility of social advancement that the war had brought them and go back to being shopkeepers and servants. Women's emancipation. Something that historians still wrangle over is how much World War I liberated women. In reality, women's work was already on the rise before 1914, and once the war was over, many women went back to their old jobs. However, without doubt, women successfully carried out a huge number of traditionally masculine roles during the war. And without doubt, some of the post-war fashions, such as the flapper garçon, little boy look, flew in the face of pre-war feminine dress codes. Also, crucially, it was after the war that women in certain countries achieved the most important political right, the right to vote. In Great Britain, they could vote from the age of 30 in 1918. In Germany, they could vote in 1919. In the US, women could vote in all states from 1920. But in France, not until 1944, towards the end of World War II. Broken faces. The first plastic surgery. Modern surgery was born in World War I. Civil and military hospitals acted as theatres of experimental medical intervention, and the outbreak of war changed the course of plastic surgery forever. Trench warfare meant that the head and the face were especially exposed to enemy fire and received extensive trauma wounds. Countless veterans survived the war, but paid the price by ending up maimed, mutilated, and disfigured. These were the so-called broken faces, named after an expression coined in France by Colonel Yves Picot, president of the Union des Blessés de la Face et de la Tête, which was founded in 1921. By the end of hostilities, there were about 6.5 million war invalids in France. Surgeons from the warring countries faced a considerable flood of these broken faces and were charged with giving them human features again, to ease the plight of their reintegration into civil life. Missing flesh and bone were covered up with grafts, an innovation that came about by using skin from other parts of the body.
بعد ما سمعنا التيب script, try to answer this question on your own in the coming quiz, and then we will solve it together. بعد ما خلصتوا الكويز، خلينا نشوف شو المفروض يكونوا الإجابات. أول رقم موجود معنا هو 6,500,000. This number was mentioned in the last part of the article. There were 6.5 million injured soldiers in France by the end of the war. As for 30 and 1944, 30 refers to the women's voting age, and 1944 refers to the year in which women were allowed to vote in France. So, in 1918, women over the age of 30 were given the right to vote. In France, women were not given the right to vote until 1944. As for thousands, it refers to the many thousands of emancipated women who were not prepared to abandon the possibility of social advancement. As for 1901, in 1901 in Vienna, 3 blood groups A, B, and O were identified for the first time. As for 80,000, it was mentioned in the recognition of PTSD or shell shock. 80,000 British soldiers were identified as suffering from shell shock or PTSD. As for 1980, it was also mentioned in PTSD or shell shock as the year post-traumatic stress disorder was first formally recognized. هي أول سنة أقروا فيها إنه في psychological disorder اسمه post-traumatic stress disorder. وهيك بنكون خلصنا حل exercise 5 يلي موجود on page 50.